My husband's farmer uncle took me into his little room to show me what my husband doesn't have. I was startled. I was surprised. I stayed until the end to understand everything. I had always imagined that I would spend my days with Mark, my husband, in a quiet way, without any big surprises. We married young, full of dreams, and I believed, perhaps naively, that life would be a succession of happy moments, simple and easy to remember. However, like any fairy tale, reality gradually changed into something different. Each day seemed to drag on, as if time no longer had the same color, the same taste. I was with Mark, but I felt I wasn't with him. It was the last night of the holidays at Uncle James's farm, a secluded place, but one that had always been comforting to me. The country house had a peculiar energy, as if the very air was thick with memories of generations past. The large glass windows opened onto the vastness of the farm, with golden fields stretching as far as the eye could see, while the fireplace crackled in the living room, creating dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Mark was there, by the fire, laughing with the others. His eyes were red from the alcohol, and the sound of his laughter was louder than usual. He seemed to be somewhere else, in a parallel reality, where drink was his only company. I watched everything from afar, a little distant, while the smoke from the fireplace mixed with the warmth in the room, making the house even more welcoming. But I didn't feel welcomed. I felt alone, in a strange way, as if the world was going on without me. I took a sip of my wine, watching the others in the room. Aunt Louise, always so lively, was dancing to an old song, her heels making a soft echo on the wooden floor. Mark's children and their cousins were playing outside, while the rest of the family was wrapped up in drinking and endless conversations about the year's events. The noise, the chatter, the laughter, everything seemed to become distant. Every sound, every laugh, was like a curtain separating me from the rest of the world. I turned around, not knowing exactly what to look for, and then found Uncle James in the corner of the room. He was sitting in a leather armchair, a glass of whiskey in one hand, his gaze tranquil, almost melancholy. He always had this serene aura, as if he knew something the others didn't. The contrast between his age and youth was so striking. The contrast between his age and the lively youth of his family always fascinated me. He was the kind of man who, even with the distance of time and commitments, carried a quiet wisdom. And for some reason, that night, he seemed more interesting than ever. I knew he had noticed my posture. Uncle James had a rare ability to sense what others were feeling without saying a word. With a soft smile, he gestured with his head for me to come to him. At first, I hesitated. He was my husband's uncle, always so reserved, so focused on his own thoughts. But there was something about his manner that gave me a sense of security, that, for a few minutes, he could listen to me without judgment. I stood up, feeling a lightness in my legs that I didn't know was caused by the drink or the longing for a quiet conversation. I walked over to him, who was watching me intently with a discreet smile. "You seem distant tonight, Emily," he said, his voice soft like a breeze. "It's a good night, but you don't seem to be part of it." Those words hit me with a precision I hadn't expected. How could he notice something so subtle? I was there, in the middle of the party, and I seemed invisible. He knew exactly how I felt. "I don't know," I replied, trying to organize my words. "It's like people are somewhere else, but I can't connect. Mark, he's so far away, and I don't know if it's just me who's feeling it or if I don't know anymore." He looked at me with compassion, in no hurry to interrupt me, as if he was waiting for me to open up a little more. That simple display of attention made my chest tighten. I didn't know why, but I felt like talking more about what was bothering me. "Is he all right, Emily?" Uncle James asked, and his voice sounded deeper, more curious, as if he had asked this question many times before but still didn't know the answer. I looked at Mark, who was on the other side of the room, talking animatedly with some relatives. He seemed so lost in his own party that he barely noticed me. How could he be so distant, even though he was physically so close? That emptiness inside me grew. "He's fine. He's just not with me," I replied, my voice trembling. "I feel like he's in another world, and I'm here, just watching. I don't know what happened to us. Uncle James didn't say anything immediately. He just stood up calmly, straightening his clothes, and gestured with his hand, as if inviting me for a walk. How about a walk around the farm? The fresh air might help you think. I didn't want to be alone with my thoughts, but something in the way he said it made me accept. Without hesitation, I followed Uncle James to the door, which he opened gently, letting the chilly night air invade the room. The countryside was quiet. The trees, imposing and ancient, stood tall against the starry sky, while the gentle sound of the wind made the leaves dance. The full moon illuminated the path, and for a moment, I felt that this simple gesture of leaving the party and walking through the countryside brought me a sense of peace that I hadn't felt for a long time. Sometimes, you need a little breathing space, Emily, he said, breaking the silence. Life piles up on us, and, without realizing it, we start to forget who we are in the midst of it all. I looked at him, listening intently. His words seemed to fit perfectly with how I felt. He was right. I had lost myself. I just wanted to feel something again. I feel like I've been erased, I said, my voice almost imperceptible. Uncle James stopped, looked at me with his calm, wise eyes, and then said, as if it were the conclusion to a long-awaited conversation, "Sometimes people need a fresh start, Emily, but it's up to you to decide what that means." We continued walking in silence, and I knew that those words had resonated in a way that I might never fully understand. But one thing was clear. Something inside me was changing. The night was progressing, and the party seemed to have no end. The loud music, the laughter, and the din of conversation echoed through the house, filling the room with a frenetic energy, but I felt distant from it all, as if I were observing the world around me from a place far away. The walls of the house, which normally made me feel welcome, now seemed to enclose me, as if the sound and joy had become something suffocating. I wanted to be away. I wanted to breathe, to find a moment of calm and clarity. As the party went on, Mark was drunk and, as always, indulging in alcohol with more intensity than I could ever comprehend. He was sitting on the sofa with his family friends, laughing loudly and talking about anything without noticing me. It was nothing new, but that night seemed different. I felt like a stranger in my own home, a sense of misfit, of not belonging. As we walked out of the door, the cool breeze enveloped me, relieving the tension I didn't even know I was carrying in my body. Uncle James, with his calm and constant presence, walked beside me, in no hurry to ask questions. He knew, somehow, that I needed that silence, that space to organize myself. I watched him more closely, as if, that night, he was the only one who understood the depth of the emptiness that was spreading inside me. He always had a quiet wisdom. Something about the way he moved, the way he spoke, made me feel as if he knew more about life than anyone else. And, for a moment, I realized that he was also dealing with his own internal battles, only in a much more discreet way. The farm was quiet that night. The field stretched as far as the eye could see, with trees rising like silhouettes against the starry sky. The full moon softly illuminated the path in front of us, and I felt the freshness of the night air invade my lungs. The sound of our footsteps on the beaten earth seemed to absorb any other noise, as if the world around us had stopped. "Things seem easier to understand here," said Uncle James, breaking the silence. "Nature has this ability to remind us how simple things should be, even when our lives are full of complications." I watched him, not just as my husband's uncle, but as someone who was somehow trying to guide me. Uncle James didn't say much, but his every word carried a weight, a reflection that made me think more deeply about everything I felt. I was so immersed in the confusion of my own feelings that I hardly knew what to do with that feeling of being lost. "I don't know what's happening to me," I finally said, breaking the silence. "I look at Mark and I don't recognize him anymore. I only see the person he was, but the one who's here now is someone different, and I don't know what to do with that." Uncle James looked at me with a serious gaze, but at the same time, there was a softness in his eyes, as if he was understanding every word I was saying in no hurry to respond. "Change is a difficult thing to deal with, Emily," he finally said, his voice low and quiet. "People change, sometimes unintentionally, and life pushes us to places where we don't always know how to react. But it's in the difficulties that we discover ourselves, in the moments of crisis that we begin to understand who we really are." I felt strange listening to him. His words touched something inside me that I couldn't name. He spoke of change, of crisis, of discoveries, and I wondered if this was happening to me. Was I changing? Was I looking for something outside of myself because I couldn't find it inside anymore? The walk took us to a more secluded part of the farm, where the cottage gave way to a small wood, with old trees that curved over the path, creating a kind of natural tunnel. The sound of the night, with the rustling of leaves and the distant howl of some animal, seemed even more profound there. The stillness was palpable, and I felt that as we went along, the tension in my chest eased a little, as if the environment was allowing me to let go, to get away from the confusion that had settled in my mind. Uncle James, who had always been a man of few words, now seemed more open, more willing to share something of himself. He paused for a moment, looking at the horizon, before looking at me again. "There's a place on the farm that only a few of us know about," he said, his voice low but charged with a certain emotion. "It's a place where I can think, reflect, where I can reconnect with everything I've lost along the way." I looked at him curiously, wanting to know more. Something in the way he said it made me feel that we were heading towards something important, something he wanted to show me. "I didn't know there was anything like that here," I said, the tone of my voice softer, more receptive. Uncle James smiled, as if he were sharing a secret. He began to guide me along a narrow path where the moonlight barely reached. The atmosphere became even more mysterious as we approached the place. I didn't know what to expect, but I felt that this was exactly what I needed. Something unexpected, something that would take me out of my comfort zone and make me see life differently. Finally, we arrived at a small shelter, hidden among the trees. A simple building, but one that seemed to carry a weight of history. Uncle James led me in with the familiarity of someone who had been there many times before. He pushed open the wooden door with a soft click, and the smell of aged wood mixed with earth invaded my senses. "This is my place," he said, his voice almost like a whisper, "where I can disconnect from everything and reflect on who I am and what I want out of life." Inside, the atmosphere was welcoming, with simple but well-kept furniture and a few objects scattered around the room that seemed to have a special meaning for him. Uncle James invited me to sit in a comfortable armchair while he moved around the room, picking up a glass of whiskey and settling into another chair. The silence between us was comfortable, but also charged with a tension that I couldn't fully understand. As I watched him, something changed in me. I felt a mixture of respect and something else, something I couldn't name. He was there, in front of me, offering something I would never have expected. His company, his attention, and a way of making me see life through different eyes. "Sometimes we're so busy trying to find answers that we forget to live the questions," he said, looking at me with a deep gaze. I didn't know what to say. His words echoed in my mind, like an invitation to something I wasn't ready to understand, but which was somehow beginning to awaken something inside me. I settled in, not knowing exactly what to expect, but with the feeling that, in that space, something big was about to happen. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but charged with a tension I couldn't name. Time seemed to slow down there, as if everything was calmer, deeper. "Emily, do you know what it means to allow yourself?" he asked, his voice soft, almost like a whisper. Sometimes we don't know how to open ourselves up to the things that really matter, because we're afraid of losing control. But the truth is, by allowing yourself, you gain more than you realize. You find yourself in a way you never thought possible. I looked at him, absorbing every word, feeling a kind of magnetism in his presence. He was talking about something that, until that moment, I had never considered so deeply. I had always tried to control my life, my choices, my emotions. But there, In that place, next to him, I felt like I was being pushed to see something different. I never thought about it like that, I said, my voice softer than I had intended. I always thought that things had to be done a certain way, that I had to follow the rules, but maybe I missed the chance to discover something more, something that lies beyond the surface. Uncle James watched me in silence for a moment, as if evaluating my words. His eyes, normally so calm, seemed to carry something else, something that he didn't say but that was there, in that instant, like a soft weight that accumulated between us. "You've allowed yourself to be here, Emily," he said, as if it were a statement, not a question. "And that's a start. When we allow ourselves, when we let life flow, unexpected things happen." I didn't know what that meant to me, but as I looked at him, I felt a silent connection, an exchange that went beyond words. He was making me see something inside myself that I had never known existed. A curiosity, a desire to go deeper, to understand who I really was and what I wanted out of life. I didn't know what would happen next, but at that moment, I felt something important rising up inside me, something I couldn't ignore. The warmth of the fireplace, the smell of the wood, the quiet presence of Uncle James. Everything seemed to envelop me in an almost magical way. I was about to discover something much greater than I had imagined. The night seemed to drag on in a calm that I hadn't experienced before. We were in Uncle James's small country house, and while the flames in the fireplace danced softly, a comfortable silence settled between us. He was there, sitting opposite me, his eyes deep and attentive, as if he were observing something beyond my appearance. I, for my part, felt a growing curiosity, a desire to understand myself and the moment that was unfolding there. Uncle James seemed quite at ease. After all, he was already taking off his shoes, as if the weight of the world was something distant, something he didn't feel with the intensity that I did. He didn't rush, he didn't force me to speak, but his presence was a constant invitation for me to open up. Something about his tranquility seemed to have the power to calm the storms inside me. I wasn't sure how I had gotten there, but I knew that the feeling of being in that space, with him, was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The farm, the silent countryside, and especially that little refuge, all seemed to carry an energy that I could no longer ignore. Uncle James's aura, serene and calm, seemed to envelop me, as if he were a mirror reflecting parts of myself that I still didn't fully understand. The flame from the fireplace softly illuminated the room, and the shadows danced on the wooden walls. The air was cool, but the warmth of the fire made everything cozy. I felt a sense of welcome, a security that made me want to stay there, in silence, just soaking up the moment. Uncle James was watching the fire, but not with the distance of someone who was just getting warm. He seemed to be reflecting, lost in deep thought, while I, next to him, tried to organize the words that had accumulated inside me. "You've never told me why you like this place so much," I said, my voice soft, trying to better understand the enigma it represented. He laughed softly, but it wasn't a humorous laugh. It was more like an expression of acceptance, as if the question was a door he knew I needed to open. He looked at me, his eyes penetrating but gentle, and replied, "Because here, I can be who I really am. There are no expectations, no pressures, only what is essential. This is where I learn to understand myself, away from everything the world demands of us." "What about this box down here, Uncle James?" I said, pointing my finger. "There are some accessories I use with my companions. Would you like to see them?" I was nervous and didn't know what to do, but after all, I was already there. "Of course, if we're in the fire, we have to burn ourselves," I said, laughing. When he opened it, I confess I was stimulated. There were handcuffs, accessories, and about 3 toys, all to give us more happiness and pleasure in that wonderful moment, you know. "If I ask you something, will you promise not to tell my husband?" "Of course, just tell him, my dear," he said, putting his hand on my shoulder and looking into my eyes. "I want you to use all this with me. My husband doesn't do anything like that." When I'd finished speaking, he went to the door and locked it. And that was the first time I felt that I could be happy even when I was married. It's not over yet. Click on the cards and keep going.